The fact was that I realized very late in life that my family had been impacted by partition. But my paternal family lived for nearly a decade in Kingsway refugee camp. Multiple generations to have very, very different opinions on this event of partition, because I think each generation perceives history differently as well. And it's very hard to hold on to other people's sadness. My educational background is as an artist. I'm actually trained as a metal engraver. And so my introduction to oral history was purely out of interest. The fact was that I realized very late in life that my family had been impacted by partition. And I began thinking that if I know so little, then the generation after me will know even less. And so I started recording stories, which I would later realize was oral history, because I wanted to know more about my family, and then from my family extended to friends, to family friends, neighbors, and then strangers. And it's not just the fact that we are recording individual stories, it's the fact that together they make a collective history, which I think for a long time when it comes to partition, not only has not been recorded, but I think the voices of people have sort of been erased in a way. So in some way, being immersed in oral history also brings back the voices of people who experienced it, people who are in the last leg of their lives, and it's very important for us to preserve these stories which would otherwise be forgotten. Both my paternal and maternal family came from across the border. In different cities. So my paternal family came from this place called Malhotra and the Northwest Frontier Province, and both my maternal grandparents came from Lahore, and they all settled in Delhi. But my paternal family lived for nearly a decade in Kingsway refugee camp, and actually that's where my grandparents met and fell in love and got married. And my grandfather then went on to start this bookshop called Bhari Sons. And I think in some way they all hoped they would get a chance to go back, but no one ever did. And from my family, my parents went for work to Pakistan, but I think I was the first person who went to sort of rediscover anything that had been left behind. Growing up, I didn't hear any stories, and I think that really created a sort of vacuum around my knowledge, because I grew up in the 90s with the knowledge of Kargil, the wars that India and Pakistan have fought, and our history on both sides of the border is also very limited and also beneficial to that particular country. It has national allegiances. And so I think for young children who, well, not young, my generation also, millennials and those that came after, there is a very complicated negotiation we have to do with what we hear in the news and what we learnt in our history books versus what we may hear at home as stories. And those stories could range from stories of belonging and lament and longing and kindness to stories of violence and hate and prejudice and bias. And both can exist sometimes simultaneously also, because as you said, it's memory, and memory is a very complicated, malleable thing. Memory is not a recording device. What we remember is not, it doesn't appear as a picture. It is altered by the present world and certainly by present day events as well. And I think one of the things I was most surprised about when I was doing my field research with people is how they could feel longing for the land they had left behind, but also feel a certain sense of enmity, because now that land was, is prescribed as our enemy, or we have to feel a certain way about it. So I feel that conflict within people's minds also was very interesting and can exist simultaneously. A few years ago, I heard a story from a young man who grew up in Pakistan, and his village was right in the mountains. So from his village he could see a very foggy sort of image of a temple across the border. And later in life he would learn that temple was Vaishno Devi, a very big temple in Jammu. But all through his life, that image of the temple caused him great anxiety, because everybody said that that's enemy territory, they had just fought Kargil. And as he began questioning about the temple, he was surprised to learn that his father spoke about the temple with a lot of warmth, not a lot of negativity. And the reason for that was that his family came from Jammu and they had migrated during partition. So when the young man looked at the temple, he would feel anxiety about why do we live so close to the border if India Pakistan are always fighting. But his father, who had heard stories from his father, longed to go back to that temple and to see Vaishno Devi again, because that's where his family had come from. And I think this is the kind of, you were speaking about how generations feel differently about things, and I think it's very possible for multiple generations to have very, very different opinions on this event of partition, because I think each generation perceives history differently as well. Recently, I launched a new book in December 2022, which was my first novel. It's called The Book of Everlasting Things, and it's called The Book of Everlasting Things. And it is a story that focuses on two families in pre-partition Lahore, a Hindu family of perfumers and a Muslim family of calligraphers, and they go through World War I, World War II and partition. So it's quite a large, expansive novel. And I had a lot of trouble moving from historian to novelist, because I think the narrative of fiction is so malleable and it does things we don't expect. And with non-fiction, there is so much control over things, there is so much planning involved, and you very rarely deviate from that planning. So to foray into fiction is very hard, and fiction is very demanding, but it is also very rewarding. And I write about partition in a very different way in the novel. It is, of course, the experience of partition, but also the memory of partition. And I don't think I could have written the novel without doing all the work I did in oral history, because it helped to make the narrative very authentic and I think just nuanced. You know, the specificity of memory that you collect from people is very rarely seen in novels. And I think I was very happy to be able to bring that into the narrative. Well, I never heard any stories of partition growing up. The word I heard a lot was refugee, because my grandfather had started a bookshop in what was a refugee market in Delhi. It was a market called Khan Market, made for post-partition rehabilitation, economic rehabilitation. And he would always say, shop in a refugee market. We have a shop in a refugee market. So as a child, I heard that word a lot, but as a child, you don't really understand what that word means, or the connotations, the larger connotations it has. And so now if I think back, growing up, maybe they did not speak directly about partition or Pakistan, but they definitely spoke about the cities and villages they came from. But as a child, because they sounded so similar to villages and cities in India, I never understood the place to be across the border, or, you know, a country that we were at war with, or even a country that we had been a part of once. It just seemed like kind of rural happiness they were talking about, because I noticed that people who have migrated during partition mostly only take the names of villages and cities. They will say, I'm from Lucknow, or I'm from Dera Ismail Khan, or I'm from Lahore, or I'm from Calcutta. They will not say that I'm from India or I'm from Pakistan, because their associations are not to the nation state. They are to the home, the village, the city, the neighborhood, the zilla. And there is obviously a sense of nostalgia in that, because it connects them directly to childhood. But when I began these interviews with people, I don't think they really understood why I wanted to know about their memories that were obviously still quite traumatic. I started working in this field in 2013, so it's been a decade now. And at the beginning, I was also learning how to speak about this aged trauma, but how to speak to older people, because these conversations become quite vulnerable quite quickly, and particularly in South Asian culture, there is, the older person takes care of the younger person, and in these conversations where people would unburden and they would discuss things that maybe they hadn't discussed, and they would break down, I was comforting them, and I think about the interview process a lot. I think about what happens when we try to return to a past that we have not wanted to return to for so long, and why we do that. And a lot of these people were simply returning to that time because I had asked them, because I didn't know anything, and I was afraid that future generations won't know anything. But I think the process of interviewing someone is very sacred. It is a privilege to listen to these stories, but they can also consume your life very quickly, and it's very hard to hold on to other people's sadness. I've always found that the generation that lived through partition, though they may feel anger, there is no hate as such. I mean, I can't generalize. There will always be people that will feel hate depending on their experiences of the time. But I always find that it's the second or later generations that fuel that hate. While speaking about partition, generally we very conveniently put it in the very easy dichotomies of us versus them, Hindu versus Muslim, Muslim versus Sikh, but it's far more complicated than that. It is not so easy. And when you speak to a person who has lived through partition, you will see that no story is linear. No memory is linear. They will always meander. Like, for instance, they will say that we witnessed so much violence, but our Sikh neighbor helped us, or our Muslim neighbor hid us for 25 days, or, I don't think any story is as simple as it is made to seem with partition, or as it is being used in today's day to pit one community against another. So when I record these stories, do I think that it will create a change in the way we perceive our neighbors, but also those who are different than us? Yes, I hope so. But I also realize that that change cannot happen overnight, because that prejudice or that bias has settled over many decades. So it takes perhaps an equal amount of time or even more to break that cycle of thinking in that way.